Here are the top 10 most unbelievable survival stories on the Joe Rogan Experience. In episode 1244 with Colin O'Brady, he recounts one of the most extreme tests of human endurance ever attempted. It's a journey to the very edge of survival, a climb through the death zone of Mount Everest, where every step could be your last, and where 3 people lost their lives on the same day Colin stood at the summit.
Colin O'Brady isn't just an athlete. He's a man obsessed with a single question: what are our limits? His adventures weren't just about climbing mountains. They were about showing the world that the boundaries we set are often far below what we're truly capable of. But no challenge would push him closer to those limits than Everest. Back in 2014, Colin and his wife Jenna sat in their tiny one-bedroom apartment, staring at a whiteboard. He wasn't a world-famous athlete, didn't have sponsors, didn't even have a social media following. But he had a dream: to complete the Explorer's Grand Slam, climbing the tallest mountain on each of the 7 continents, plus reaching both the North and South Poles. Fewer than 50 people in history had ever done it, and Colin wasn't just aiming to join them. He wanted to be the fastest person in history to complete it. The problem? He didn't have the experience you'd expect. Sure, he'd grown up outdoors in Oregon, had climbed some mountains, used crampons and ice axes, but he wasn't a veteran alpinist with decades of training. To anyone else, the idea seemed impossible, but Colin and Jenna didn't say, "I can't." They asked instead, "What's the first step?" Piece by piece, they built a plan. They learned how to market, how to pitch sponsors, how to launch a campaign. They weren't experts. They were literally Googling, what's the difference between PR and marketing? But they kept moving forward. And slowly, the impossible began to take shape. By 2016, Colin was ready. The Explorer's Grand Slam would take him through 9 brutal expeditions, including Mount Everest. And Everest, the highest point on Earth, would become the greatest test of his life. By the time Colin reached Everest, he had already completed 100 days of other mountains and polar crossings. He was exhausted, but he pressed on. Unlike many climbers, he wasn't with a big guided team. It was just Colin and a Sherpa named Pausing Boat, whom he had met during previous climbs. Everest has 4 camps that climbers use to acclimatize before attempting the summit. Camp 4, perched above 26,000 feet, lies inside what's known as the death zone, up here. Even with supplemental oxygen, the human body can't survive for long. It's the same area where John Krakauer's Into Thin Air documented the infamous 1996 disaster that killed 11 climbers. Colin and Pausing set up their tent at Camp 4, but almost immediately, disaster struck. A massive snowstorm and windstorm rolled in, so powerful it took them 2.5 hours just to pitch their tent. Their summit push was over before it even began. They spent a miserable night just trying to survive. By morning, the weather was no better. They had no choice but to retreat all the way back to Camp 2. Most climbers would have quit right there. Spending a night in the death zone drains the body, and making a second attempt is almost unheard of. But Colin wasn't ready to give up. And then luck intervened. Another climber, too sick to continue, offered Colin his spare oxygen bottles. That small gift gave Colin one last shot at the summit. When Colin and Pausing pushed back up to Camp 4, they were stunned by what they saw. Because the mountain had been closed in 2014 after an avalanche, and again in 2015 after a devastating earthquake, no one had climbed Everest for 2 years. Now, in 2016, with weather windows so small, over 100 climbers were attempting the summit on the exact same day. The result? A traffic jam at 28,000 feet. Normally, climbers clip into a single fixed rope for safety. But standing in line at -40 degrees would mean frostbite and almost certain failure. So Colin and Pausing made a daring choice. They unclipped from the rope entirely, risking a fatal fall, and free climbed past dozens of people. Step by step, breath by breath, they overtook nearly 60 climbers before finally rejoining the rope. But that's when Colin noticed something terrifying. As he paused to put on his giant down jacket, Colin pulled off his gloves for just a moment. When he looked down, his right hand was completely black. It was the telltale sign of frostbite. In the death zone, frostbite doesn't just mean pain, it means permanent damage, amputation, or worse. Colin's mind raced. Would Jenna still love me if I lost my hand? Was this the price of chasing this dream? He shoved his hand back into his glove and made a dark calculation. If I'm going to lose it anyway, wouldn't it be worth it to at least summit Everest first? For 3 agonizing hours he climbed, convinced his hand was dead. But as dawn broke, sunlight flooded the mountain. Colin looked down again, and his hand was perfectly fine. The culprit wasn't frostbite at all. A chemical hand warmer had broken open inside his glove, staining his skin black. Relief washed over him. His hand was safe. After hours of climbing, Colin and Pazing reached the summit ridge. To one side, a sheer 5,000-foot drop into Nepal. To the other, 5,000 feet into Tibet. A knife-edge ridge led them to the very top of the world. On that same day, however, 3 other climbers weren't so lucky. One slipped and fell to his death. 2 others succumbed to altitude sickness, cerebral edema, where the brain fills with fluid from lack of oxygen. Colin saw firsthand how helpless the situation can be. At one point, he came across a Brazilian woman he knew, collapsed in the snow, oxygen mask askew. He tried to lift her, to carry her, but at nearly 29,000 feet, his body simply wouldn't respond. He wrapped his arms around her, begging her to wake up, pleading with her to fight. Luckily, her Sherpa team fixed her oxygen and she survived, but for the others, rescue was impossible. On Everest, even the strongest climbers can barely move themselves. Carrying another body down is beyond human strength. It was a harsh reminder, up there, survival depends entirely on your own 2 feet. Finally, Colin stepped onto the summit of Everest. He had done it, against the storm, the traffic jam, the frostbite scare, and the death surrounding him. But as he descended, another twist awaited. Back at Camp 4, he called Jenna. His body was wrecked, his feet burned from overheated boot warmers, but he was alive. And that's when Jenna dropped the bombshell. "Colin," she said, "if you move fast, you can set not just 1 world record, but 2. The plan was insane. Normally, climbers rest for weeks before attempting another peak. But if Colin could descend Everest, fly to Alaska immediately, and climb Denali in just 3 days instead of 3 weeks, he'd claim a second record. Exhausted, but unwilling to ignore Jenna's plan, Colin put his boots back on. Within 100 hours of summiting Everest, he was on another mountain, racing to complete the explorer's Grand Slam, *.
Colin O'Brady's story is not just about climbing Everest. It's about the power of refusing to say, "I can't." From a 1-bedroom apartment with no money and no following, he pushed himself into history. On Everest, he faced storms, frostbite scares, death, and despair. Yet he kept moving forward. His survival and triumph remind us that human potential stretches far beyond what we imagine. Sometimes all it takes is one more step, one more push past the moment we think we've reached our limit. In episode number 1622 of the Joe Rogan Experience, Marcus Luttrell sits down to recount a story that pushes the limits of human endurance, courage, and sheer will to survive. This is the story of Operation Red Wings, a mission that would become one of the most harrowing survival tales in modern military history.
Marcus wasn't just another soldier in Afghanistan. He was a Navy SEAL part of one of the most elite fighting forces in the world. SEAL training alone breaks most who attempt it. Those who survive the infamous Hell Week are cut from a different cloth entirely. Marcus had already been through grueling deployments, dangerous operations, and the constant reality that war offers no guarantees. But nothing in his career could have fully prepared him for the events that unfolded in June of 2005. Their objective seemed clear: insert deep into the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan's Kunar province to locate and eliminate a high-value Taliban leader. The region was as hostile as it was beautiful: steep ridges, rocky outcroppings, and dense forests. The air was thin, the terrain brutal. And somewhere in those hills was Ahmad Shah, a man responsible for orchestrating deadly attacks against U.S. forces. Marcus's team consisted of 4 SEALs: Lieutenant Michael Murphy, gunner's mate Danny, Dietz, sonar technician Matthew Axelson, and Marcus himself. They were brothers in every sense of the word, trained to operate as a single unit, to trust one another without question. On June 28th, under the cover of darkness, they were inserted by helicopter into the mountains. The night was cold, the moonlight barely enough to make out the jagged ridgelines. Their mission was to move quietly, observe, gather intelligence, and wait for the right moment to strike. But in the mountains of Afghanistan, nothing stays quiet. For long hours into the mission, their position was compromised, not by enemy scouts, but by local goat herders. In that moment, the SEALs faced an impossible decision: detain the herders and risk breaking rules of engagement, or release them and risk exposure. They made the call to let them go, and that decision would set off a chain of events that changed everything. Within hours, the Taliban descended upon them, dozens of heavily armed fighters, moving fast and hard across the rocky terrain. The first bursts of gunfire shattered the stillness of the mountain air. Bullets ripped through trees and slammed into rock. The SEALs returned fire, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The firefight was relentless. Every time they tried to find cover, the enemy closed in. Marcus was hit multiple times, shrapnel tearing into his body. Danny Dietz was wounded but kept fighting. Mike Murphy, realizing they were cut off from all support, made a decision that would earn him the Medal of Honor. He moved into the open, fully exposed to enemy fire, to get a clear signal and call for help. As bullets tore into him, he relayed their position to headquarters, knowing it might cost him his life. It did. The team was taking massive casualties. Axelson fought until the very end despite being mortally wounded. Dietz, too, fell under the hail of gunfire. Marcus, battered and bleeding, was thrown down the side of the mountain by the force of explosions and sheer gravity. Tumbling through rocks and branches, he was the only one left alive. What followed was a desperate, agonizing journey through the Afghan wilderness. Marcus crawled, limped, and dragged himself across the terrain, his body broken, his water supply gone. Pain was constant. Every movement felt like a knife twisting in his muscles. He had shrapnel embedded in his legs, a broken back, and a shoulder that wouldn't function. Yet he pushed on, driven by something deeper than instinct: the refusal to quit, the promise to his brothers that he would tell their story. After days of evasion, he was discovered by members of an Afghan tribe. Under the ancient code of Pashtunwali, they took him in, protected him, and refused to hand him over to the Taliban, even when threatened. For days they hid him, fed him, and eventually coordinated with U.S. forces for his rescue. When Marcus was finally evacuated, he weighed 190 pounds when he started the mission, and had dropped to barely over 150. His body was covered in wounds, his spirit marked forever by the loss of his brothers. But he lived. And because he lived, the story of Operation Red Wings lives on, a testament to sacrifice, brotherhood, and the unbreakable will of one man who refused to die in the mountains of Afghanistan.
Marcus Luttrell's survival wasn't just about endurance. It was about loyalty, courage, and carrying the weight of his brother's memory. Operation Red Wings remains one of the most powerful reminders of what sacrifice truly means. In episode 1395 with Glenn Villeneuve, he talks about surviving in the untouched wilderness of Alaska, where nature doesn't care if you live or die. Out there, you're not the apex predator, unless you prove it.
Glenn Villeneuve had made a decision most people wouldn't even dream of. He left modern life behind and moved into the wilds of Alaska. Not to a small town or a cozy cabin with a grocery store nearby. He moved into pure, untouched wilderness. No roads, no electricity, no neighbors. Just miles and miles of snow, trees, mountains, and wildlife. In 2006, Glenn was living deep in the Arctic region of Alaska with his wife and infant daughter. This was not a weekend survival trip. This was their life. Every meal had to be hunted. Every drop of water had to be fetched or melted from snow. Every single mistake could be fatal. That winter, things got difficult. The caribou migration, which Glenn depended on for food, never came. The family had already harvested a moose earlier in the year, about 500 pounds of meat, but that was long gone. With the cold tightening its grip and no food left, Glenn was left with a brutal choice. Either he stayed put and risked starving, or he headed out into the wilderness in search of meat. So he packed his gear, grabbed his rifle, and set off into the snowy mountains. At this point, temperatures were dropping below -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Glenn had no GPS, no radio contact, just a rifle and his instinct. He followed tracks in the snow for hours, high up into the ridgelines. Then he saw something strange, a single wolf's paw prints. And near those, a larger trail. The distinct tracks of a caribou. He realized what he was seeing, a chase. A lone wolf was tracking a wounded caribou. Glenn followed both trails as fast as he could through deep snow, determined to find the scene before the wolf finished the job. Eventually, the tracks led him to the edge of a rocky slope. Peering over, he saw exactly what he feared and hoped for. The wolf had brought the caribou down. But as soon as it noticed Glenn, the wolf slipped away into the trees, silent and invisible. At the base of the slope was the kill, a fresh caribou carcass, still steaming in the cold air. Glenn climbed down, dressed the animal quickly, and packed as much meat as he could into the rib cage of the carcass, using it as a makeshift backpack. Strapping it to his shoulders, he began the long, cold walk home. By the time he returned to his cabin, the sun had dipped below the horizon and the temperature had dropped even further. But Glenn had done it. He'd intercepted a kill from a predator, survived the harsh terrain, and brought food home to his family. But that was just one chapter in Glenn's life in the wild. Fast forward to January 2012, another bitter winter. Glenn, now living alone, spotted something strange on the frozen lake near his home. From the top of a nearby ridge, he saw what looked like a large brown mass moving across the ice. He pulled out his binoculars and focused. What he saw stopped him cold. It wasn't a moose. It wasn't a bear. It was a pack of wolves, not just a couple. Not 4 or 5, 20. An extraordinarily large number, especially for a region like that. Wolves are territorial, and packs that big are almost unheard of. Glenn immediately grabbed his rifle and his camera. He made his way down from the ridge toward the lake, trying to get closer footage. And for a while, the wolves ignored him, circling around the remains of a fresh kill. But as Glenn started walking back toward his cabin, something shifted. He turned to Chet behind him and realized the entire pack was now following him. They were getting closer. He picked up the pace, so did they. Before long, Glenn was running across the ice, trying to make it back to the safety of his cabin. The wolves, lean and built for the terrain, closed the distance fast. He reached his front door just in time. The entire pack stopped about 50 yards away, pacing in a semicircle, their yellow eyes fixed on him. Now here's where Glenn's mindset differed from most. He knew that if he didn't take action, they'd come back. Wolves are intelligent. Once they've spotted weakness or potential food, they remember. And if they weren't afraid of him now, they might get bold later. So Glenn decided he would need to stand his ground. The next day, he went back outside, loaded his rifle, and began walking along the shoreline near the lake. As expected, the wolves reappeared. This time they charged. Glenn opened fire. He hit the lead wolf first. Another went down after that. One of the wolves was paralyzed in its back legs, dragging itself across the snow. Glenn followed it and humanely ended its suffering with a .22 rifle. When he examined the area more closely, he realized the wolves had brought down a young bull moose, but had barely started eating it. Glenn took the meat again from a fresh kill in the wild. And in doing so, asserted himself at the top of the food chain, not with dominance, but with survival instinct and sheer will. After that incident, the wolf pack never returned to his cabin again. Glenn Villeneuve didn't just live in the wilderness. He became part of its brutal, beautiful rhythm. In a world where one mistake could mean death, he lived every day on edge, proving that humans, if willing to endure enough, can survive in even the wildest corners of the planet.
In Joe Rogan Experience number 1738, Ben O'Brien recounts a chilling moment deep in the Montana wilderness. What began as an elk hunt with his father quickly turned into a confrontation with one of nature's most terrifying predators, a massive grizzly bear. Just 80 yards away, in the silence of the drainage, Ben realized he wasn't calling an elk. He was calling death itself.
Ben O'Brien was out in a quiet Montana drainage, the forest alive only with the sounds of his cow calls. His father stood nearby, bow in hand, scanning the terrain. Somewhere out there, Ben believed, a bull elk was closing in. He could see one in the distance and moving along a ridgeline, and then disappearing. But what came next wasn't an elk. From the corner of his eye, Ben caught a flash. Brown, large, powerful. It dropped down the hill ahead of him, vanished behind the ridge, and began moving toward the valley floor. Ben knew this valley well. Just a day before, a bull elk had been killed nearby. Its carcass still lay somewhere above. In his mind, the connection was immediate. Something was heading that way. He kept calling, expecting the big bull to step out, but then he turned and froze. 100 yards below him, in the dim light of the ravine, stood a bear. Ben's voice dropped to a sharp whisper. "Dad! There's a bear! There's a bear!" His father had no pistol, no bear spray, just his bow. Ben was the only thing between him and the predator. Ben had a pistol on his chest, a Taurus .44 Magnum ultralight revolver, 6 rounds in the cylinder, bear spray clipped to his belt. But at first, his hunter's instincts overrode his fear. He brought up his binoculars. In the shadows, he couldn't tell. Black bear or grizzly? That question mattered. Black bears, while dangerous, were less aggressive and less predatory. Most of the time, you could stand your ground. In Alberta, Ben had done exactly that. He even liked black bear meat. Delicious, he'd later say, and their fat rendered into grease was a hunter's prize. But grizzlies were different. Territorial, carnivorous, unpredictable. He once compared the difference to a golden retriever versus a wolf, harmless versus apex predator. The bear below moved with slow, deliberate power, sauntering up the drainage. And then, Ben saw it. The hump on its back, the sheer mass of its hindquarters. This was no black bear. This was a grizzly, and one of the largest he'd ever seen. 6.5, maybe 7 feet tall. Weight, at least 600 pounds, maybe 700. Later, he and his father would find its track pressed into the dirt road they walked every morning. The paw print was massive, evidence of a super predator in its prime. At that moment, Ben realized something chilling. He'd been cow calling, making elk sounds, and he was doing it directly to a grizzly. In reality, the bear was only seconds away from him. A full sprint, and it could close 80 yards in less than 2 heartbeats. And yet, he didn't draw his pistol, didn't pull the bear spray. He watched, observed, calculated. It wasn't fearlessness, it was focus. As a hunter, he wanted to know what the animal was doing, why it was here. But if it turned toward them, there'd be no time. Ben had heard enough stories to know what would happen next. Hunters mauled in seconds, faces torn away, legs shattered. One man he knew, Glenn Bond, had been saved by his own son, who shot a bear at point-blank range with a .454 Cazul revolver as it tore into his father. That bear had stood over 5 feet at the shoulder and weighed more than 800 pounds. Ben knew, if this grizzly chose to come at them, the fight would be over before it began. But then, luck turned. The bear kept walking up the drainage, moving steadily toward the elk carcass. It passed through the timber and disappeared into the forest. The encounter was over. Almost. Because in Ben's mind, the story didn't end there. He remembered the other time he'd been in true grizzly country, on a caribou hunt in the Northwest Territories. He and his group had been dropped by helicopter into the middle of nowhere, forced to wait before hunting. It was August. There was no darkness, only endless daylight. From a ridgeline, they spotted a grizzly moving down a drainage, smashing through every bush, tearing up moss, each step radiating aggression. He didn't know why. Maybe she'd lost a cub to a male, maybe she was simply in a foul mood, but she was a force of destruction, and if she'd come toward them then, he wouldn't have stood a chance. That's the reality of where grizzlies live. They don't live near hospitals. They live in places where, if they hit you, you're done, unless someone with you can fight them off. Ben had also heard of encounters where survival meant enduring the attack until the bear lost interest. Others were saved by friends. Most weren't saved at all. Back in Montana that day, though, the grizzly didn't turn, didn't charge. It walked away. At its closest, it had been 80 yards from them, 2 seconds from impact, and Ben knew he probably wouldn't have drawn in time. Later, he'd joke that if he had been mauled, maybe he'd take up something safer. Roller skating, crochet, anything that didn't involve facing down 600 pounds of pure muscle, claws and teeth. That day, Ben O'Brien kept his face and his life. But in the silence of that drainage, he learned something else. When you're calling for elk in grizzly country, sometimes the thing that answers isn't what you hoped for.
Ben O'Brien walked away that day, but not without a lesson etched into his memory. In grizzly country, you're never truly the hunter. Sometimes you're just prey, and survival comes down to seconds, luck, and the will of the wild. And for Ben, that close encounter remains a reminder that when you speak into the silence of the mountains, you never know what might answer. In MMA Show, episode 121 with Bobby Green, he shares the harrowing story of a first-time offender thrown into one of the most dangerous prisons in America, where survival meant learning the rules fast, or not making it out at all.
His first stop was the Atlanta County Jail, in a large open modular unit where inmates of all races were mixed together. The rules there were simple. You could speak to and trade with anyone, but you could only eat with people of your own race. When he was later transferred to California, those rules became far stricter. There, no trading or sharing was allowed between races. The prison population was divided into cars, whites, blacks, Mexicans, and others, each lead by a key holder who represented their group. In any major conflict, alliances formed quickly. Whites and Mexicans would unite against blacks. Not knowing these unwritten rules, he made a critical mistake. While being held in a California psych ward during extradition, a black inmate offered to teach him chess. He accepted and sat at the man's table, instantly violating the racial boundaries. Within hours, he was attacked by a white supremacist inmate, transferred again. He found himself surrounded by skinheads who assumed he was one of them because of his shaved head. One inmate tried to hide a shank in his cell, but he refused. In prison, that refusal can be dangerous, and it was. The confrontation turned violent, and he overpowered the man, choking him unconscious and dragging him out bleeding. That fight unexpectedly elevated his status. Even though first-time inmates weren't supposed to lead, he became the de facto key holder for the white car because no one wanted to challenge him for it. This allowed him to negotiate directly with other races and defuse potential riots, many of which started over the smallest misunderstandings, but his earlier fight had left him with a prison hit order. At one point, he overheard 2 large inmates in a courthouse holding tank discussing their plan to attack him. Unaware he was sitting right there, later he was transferred, or caught chain, with the same man he had fought before. That man swore he would kill him. The destination was our J. Donovan Correctional Facility, a maximum security level 4 prison, locked in reception for months. He struck up a conversation with the inmate in the next cell, talking through the air, vent, and even playing chess. One day, that inmate asked him to kick over a cord from his cell. He obliged. Later, a package sent by String arrived containing a bag of weed. He passed it to his cellmate, who traded it for supplies. The man next door turned out to be the key holder for the Bloods, and that simple act of cooperation would soon save his life. One day, the Blood key holder called to him through the vent, "They're going to pop your door. 2 guys are coming for you." His cellmate already knew. In such situations, they warn the cellmate so he can get out of the way. When the door opened, the cellmate ran. Two attackers rushed in, one armed with a shank. The fight exploded out of the cell, up and down the stairs. He used one attacker as a human shield, choking him until he went limp while fending off the other. Guards watched without intervening. By the time it was over, one man lay unconscious with blood in his eyes, and the other had been beaten down. He was moved to a gymnasium unit with 300 inmates and more freedom. A guard pulled him aside and said, "I really appreciate what you did out there. That was pretty amazing." For him, it wasn't amazing, it was survival. And for a first-time offender thrown into one of the most dangerous environments imaginable, surviving meant learning the rules fast, standing his ground, and knowing when to make the right allies.
From his first mistake at a prison chess table to surviving a deadly 2-on-1 attack, his journey was a crash course in prison politics. In a place where one wrong move can end you, he proved that quick thinking and sheer will can mean the difference between life and death. In episode number 2013, with Paul Rosoli, the wild heart of the Amazon comes alive, a place where legends walk on water and shadows hide monsters. Deep in the floating forests, Paul found himself face to face with a living dragon, an anaconda so massive it blurred the line between myth and reality.
Deep in the heart of the Amazon, where rivers snake through endless jungle and the night feels alive with ancient eyes, Paul Rosoli found himself walking on something that barely seemed real. It was called the floating forest, a bizarre place, where entire mats of grass and vegetation floated above a drowned woodland. Walking there meant stepping over treetops that were submerged 30 or 40 feet beneath you. The ground felt unstable, alive, quivering under every step. And in that alien environment, one creature thrived more than any other, the anaconda. Paul was there with his friend JJ, long past midnight. The stars shone bright in the water's black reflection as they crept across the mats of floating grass, listening to every ripple, scanning every shadow. Paul wasn't just looking for snakes, he was chasing something bigger. He dreamed of capturing images that might one day land him on the cover of National Geographic. He wanted to find proof of the monsters whispered about in local legend. Anacondas so large they seemed to defy nature. That night, he would come closer to that legend than ever before. As they moved quietly, JJ suddenly froze. He pointed to the ground where thick grass had been pushed flat. "This is an anaconda," he whispered. Paul shook his head. "No way, not that big." The path pressed into the vegetation was wider than anything Paul thought possible for a snake. Crocodiles leave tracks, giant fish stir the water. But this was something else. Moments later, in the stillness of the floating forest, they saw it. Long, the other was slightly smaller, a 16-footer. The size alone was overwhelming. These weren't snakes. They were living dragons, and Paul did something few people would ever dare. He jumped on it, without hesitation. Driven by instinct and adrenaline, Paul launched himself onto the snake's back. In that moment, the jungle erupted into chaos. The anaconda reacted instantly, surging forward with terrifying strength. Its body dragged Paul across the floating grass toward the dark water. He clung on, fingers digging into its scales, but the snake was so thick around that his hands couldn't even touch. "My fingers couldn't meet," Paul recalled later. That's how enormous it was. At the edge of the raft, the snake slipped into the water, and Paul's face plunged forward into the black depths. For a split second, he stared into a void that seemed bottomless, a hell of shadows and scales. He knew the snake could easily have turned, wrapped him in coils, and crushed the life out of him. Its head was bigger than a Rottweiler's, massive, prehistoric, terrifying, but instead of striking, the anaconda chose escape. It dove deeper, sliding past Paul in a torrent of muscle. He felt the enormity of its body rushing by, his hand brushing the slick scales until finally the massive tail whipped past him, disappearing into the abyss. Then there was silence. Just Paul, alone in the dark, clinging to grass in the middle of the Amazon. When he finally turned around, he saw JJ, pale as a ghost, staring in shock. JJ hadn't moved, his circuits were blown. "You could have helped," Paul snapped. But JJ was speechless. To understand the danger, you have to picture where they were. The floating forest wasn't solid land. It was mats of vegetation. islands drifting over black water 30 to 40 feet deep. Every step was precarious. Every vibration could alert predators. And this was prime anaconda territory. Later, Paul explained that these floating rafts worked like giant drumheads. When an animal stepped on them, the vibrations echoed through the water, alerting any lurking snake. Old, powerful predators like giant anacondas or crocodiles used this environment to their advantage. They'd wait patient until something made a mistake. Then they'd strike. That night, Paul had almost become the mistake, but Paul wasn't done. Days later, with his team, he encountered another massive snake, not the 25-footer from that night, but still enormous. This one measured 18 feet, 6 inches long, and weighed over 220 pounds. The capture was chaos. His team leapt from boats into the floating grass, struggling to pin the snake as it thrashed. JJ grabbed the tail. Other members clung desperately to coils. Paul fought his way to the head. Once he seized it, he knew the real danger began. Anacondas don't go quietly. At any moment, it could have wrapped him again, crushing bone and suffocating lungs. But somehow, together, the team managed to control it long enough for scientists to take measurements. This female was old, scarred, a true queen of the Amazon. Her head was massive, her body thick as a tree trunk. Paul described it simply. That was the queen of the Amazon. With respect for the animal, they didn't harm her. Instead, they inserted a radio transmitter, swallowed like a pill, to track her movements. For months, they learned about her range and habits before finally releasing her back into the jungle. When Paul tells the story, the awe is still in his voice. He compares holding that snake's head to holding on to something that shouldn't exist, something out of myth. The size, the power, the danger, it all felt impossible. And yet, in that moment, standing chest deep in the black water of the Amazon, he realized something profound. Nature wasn't just beautiful. It was terrifying, ancient, unforgiving. One wrong move that night on the floating forest, and Paul Rosalie wouldn't be here to tell his story. The 25-foot snake could have dragged him under, crushed him in seconds, swallowed him whole. But it didn't. By luck, by instinct, by some force of chance, he survived. On Joe Rogan's podcast, Paul laughed about the absurdity of it all. He admitted that the Discovery Channel later exaggerated the size, bumping the 18-footer to 19 feet 6 inches for TV, but the truth didn't need exaggeration. The reality was incredible enough. Paul Rosalie faced a living dragon in the Amazon rainforest. He leapt on it, risked everything, and somehow walked away. For him, it wasn't just survival. It was a reminder. In the heart of the jungle, humans are not at the top of the food chain.
That night in the Amazon, Paul walked away with his life, but forever marked by the memory of 25 feet of muscle and scales slipping into the darkness. It was a reminder that, in the wild, survival often means standing inches from death, and still walking away to tell the tale. In episode 1149 of the Joe Rogan Experience, journalist Michael Scott Moore shared a harrowing survival story, one that began as a reporting trip and turned into a 2-year, 8-month hostage ordeal at the hands of Somali pirates.
Moore explains that he didn't go to Somalia chasing danger or drama. He went as a journalist, living in Berlin at the time, to research a very different book about Somali piracy. He had already spent 2011 following a year-long trial of 10 Somali pirates in Hamburg, Germany, and he felt there were parts of the larger story that other writers simply weren't getting. The plan was to go see the reality on the ground. He wasn't going alone. He teamed up with Ashwin Raymond, a documentary filmmaker with his own project. The two compared notes for months, and by the end of 2011, as the Hamburg trial continued, their plans finally aligned. They traveled in January 2012. Over the first 10 days, the trip went well. They were in a part of Somalia where other journalists had worked. This wasn't some unknown go zone. They gathered solid interviews and footage reel material. Can you only get by showing up? On the 10th day, Ashwin flew to Mogadishu. Moore accompanied him to the airport, saw him off, and started back. On the way from the airport, a truck, specifically a technical, a militia pickup fitted with a mounted cannon, was waiting. The gun was aimed through the windshield. Armed men overpowered Moore's guard and pulled Moore from the car. There were about a dozen of them, carrying Kalashnikovs. He was pushed into another vehicle. From that moment, he was a captive. To Moore, it was about ransom money, plain and simple, and, in all likelihood, the pirates had hoped to seize both men. Ashwin, by sheer luck, had left earlier via a different route to the airport. Otherwise, this might have been a two-hostage story. The timing and the route change saved him. The capture wasn't clean or painless. As he tried to hold his car door closed, pirates beat the door with gun barrels, broke his wrist, split his scalp, and smashed his glasses. Moore is nearsighted. Without glasses, he is close to blind. So the first reality of captivity wasn't just fear, it was pain and a sudden disability. He was taken first to a bush camp, then to a prison house with a couple of other hostages. Confusion layered over shock. He had no sense of what would happen next. For 1 week, there was no phone. Call home. During that same week, U.S. Navy SEALs launched a rescue in another part of central Somalia, freeing 2 hostages, including American Jessica Buchanan. Moore's captors were furious. He notes that 9 Somali guards died in that raid and that clan connections linked some of those men to the people holding him, whether as retaliation, anger, or posturing. The pirates announced a ransom for Moore, $20 million. That number wasn't just high, it became a fixed position. For almost a year, they held stubbornly to that figure. Negotiations took place, but Moore describes them as phony in the sense that the pirates weren't really negotiating. The line was drawn, $20 million, or nothing. When the pirates finally decided to let him call someone, they brought Moore to a bluff, gave him a cell phone, and told him to call. There was a problem. During his capture, all his notes were stolen, including phone numbers. He asked for the notes back. They refused. Call someone, they said. He called his mother. By that time, the FBI had already reached her and briefed her. The Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, which had given Moore a reporting grant, was also informed, as were colleagues in Berlin and family in Germany. On the phone, the pirates made him demand $20 million from his mother. He recalls smirking. The pirate snapped, "It's not funny." He answered that it was funny because it wasn't a serious demand. Still, that was their opening gambit, and as Moore would learn, they clung to it. They also threatened him. If anyone came to rescue him, like what had just happened elsewhere, he would be killed. He told his mother what they said, having no news of the outside world. She couldn't say much, but he caught something positive in her tone about the earlier SEAL raid. The pirates insisted hostages had been killed. The tone of his mother's voice made him doubt it. Only later did he learn the full story, back to the injuries. After those first days bush camp prison house, the pirates eventually brought in a doctor. Moore suspects the man was a livestock doctor, not a physician, but he was sympathetic. He insisted the wrist wasn't broken, applying a splint and sending Moore away. Moore says he could feel bones moving, but there was nothing more to be done. The wrist would set wrong and remain that way until he got home 2 years and 8 months later. Even then, he didn't rush to fix it. It was functional, and that was enough. From captivity, Moore saw inside the system. There is a familiar public narrative: frustrated fishermen defending their coastline after illegal foreign trawlers depleted fish stocks and dumped waste. Moore's view is more complicated. Yes, coastal fishing communities existed and suffered from illegal fishing, and once Somalia had no functioning government or navy, clan leaders began sending militia boats to detain fishing vessels for small ransoms, so-called license fees of perhaps $50,000 over 24 hours. In the 1990s, that was small scale and under the radar. The world started paying attention when piracy graduated to cargo ship hijackings. Some pirate groups even tried to call themselves the People's Coast Guard or a volunteer Coast Guard. And Moore says they had a point in one narrow sense. No one else was patrolling the coast. But he stresses that wasn't really what was happening in his case. He was captured on land, and many of the other hostages he met were poor fishermen taken hundreds of miles from shore. That's not coastal defense. That's kidnapping. Moore describes caught spelled caught. He pronounces it like khat, a leafy plant chewed as a stimulant. He compares it loosely to coca leaf, though he believes it acts more like a narcotic. It lifts you. Then you crash, wake up depressed, and need more. He says every pirate he met was addicted, sitting gaily before piles of khat to fuel their dependency. The guard force ran on shift, some chewed through the afternoon, crashed, then a night shift chewed, crashed at dawn, and so on. He was offered khat repeatedly and tried it a few times, 2 to 4 stems at a time, because it could change his mood, ease depression, or blunt minor illness. But he avoided habitual use. The addiction he saw in the guards was obvious. The effect on behavior mattered. Once wired, guards could become easily upset. He watched fistfights break out in front of him, not constantly, but enough to know that jittery men with AK-47s are inherently dangerous. Moore also explains how kidnapping works as part of the local economy, and how pirate bosses diversify into gun smuggling and people smuggling across the Horn of Africa. The same infrastructure as UVS, Kalashnikovs, cheap food supply chains can be used to move cargo, guns, or human beings. He says he documented that former pirate bosses were active along the Somalia to Libya route, transporting migrants who initially travel willingly. But there is a turning point in Sudan where willing often becomes unwilling, and the journey slides into abuse and captivity. He and Joe discuss Libya, where slave auctions were filmed and posted online. Modern slavery in 2018. More frames. It as a revival of historical patterns, the clans and routes used by today's smugglers are often the same as those used during the trans-Saharan slave trade. With the fall of Gaddafi, Libya became a failed state environment with rival governments, power vacuums, and lawlessness, going in the direction of Somalia, Moore says. Joe pauses on the word bulwark. Moore defines it simply as a roadblock. Gaddafi had been a barrier to certain migration paths, and once he was gone, that barrier vanished. This part matters because it shows the trip wasn't reckless. Moore and Ashwin found a Somali elder in Berlin who could extend clan protection in Somalia. The elder had successfully done this for another German journalist. Under that protection, they traveled from Galkio to the Costa Hobio, a notorious pirate town. Moore explains that pirates controlled Hobio. The government in Galkio had no influence there. If you asked, "Who's the police?" the answer was effectively the pirates. They didn't linger. They had an organized interview and lunch with a real pirate, then left at sundown. They didn't see much normal life in Hobio. The town felt subdued, controlled. Up to that point, the trip remained calculated risk, not chaos. The chaos came later, on that airport return road. Moore admits that during the ambush, his mind tried to deny what was happening. For a moment, he thought, just a roadblock. Then reality hit. This would be brutal, not only for him, but for his family. In those first days after the prison house and the bush camp, with his wrist in a sling, eyesight compromised, and pain setting in, he lived in a fog of uncertainty until the bluff and phone call. The pirate's first demand to his mother was $20 million. Moore believed this was not a serious opening and anchoring tactic. He recalls that 2 other early hostages he encountered had a combined ransom demand of $20 million, $10 million each, so perhaps the pirates were doubling the figure because he was American. Whatever the logic, the insistence on that number for almost a year is one reason the ordeal dragged on. Always the threat. If a rescue team came for him, he would be shot. That wasn't just talk. It was the condition of his existence. From day one, he communicated the threat to his mother, even while picking up in her voice that the recent SEAL rescue had not ended with hostage deaths as the pirates claimed. Only later would facts replace rumors. At one point, the pirates moved Moore to a hijacked tuna vessel for 5 months, the spring and summer of 2012, where he lived alongside 28 crew members from East and Southeast Asia. Only 5 spoke English, Filipino sailors, he says, and many couldn't even speak with each other because of language differences. Over time, the crew developed a Pidgin improvised sailors' language combining English, Chinese, and other words because that's what sailors have done for centuries. The ship was a floating Tower of Babel, Paradoxically, life on the ship felt better in one crucial way. He was not alone. Moore says company matters when you're a captive. The shared experience with the crew, despite fear, tension, and boredom, offered human contact and mutual support that you simply don't have when you're isolated on land. But as weeks became, months and months stretched toward a year and beyond, Moore says he stopped hoping he would get out alive. Negotiations were going badly. He watched the pirates' addiction cycle. He heard threats. He endured moves that could erase whatever progress outside agencies might have made in locating him, especially the transfer to the ship, which made him feel as if any prior intelligence on his whereabouts had been wiped clean. He notes that Westerners weren't usually held as long as he was, but others often endured even longer captivities. The crew of that tuna ship would be held for nearly 5 years before a 2016 release. When that day finally came, Moore was living in Berlin, and following their case, he helped raise money, traveled to Nairobi, and surprised them at the airport. The men, emerging into freedom surrounded by well-meaning strangers, suddenly saw a familiar face. One recognized him. Pandemonium followed captured, Moore says, by Reuters video. So how did his own release happen? His mother did what parents do. She fought for him. She raised money with the help of family, friends, and institutions in the US and Germany, including magazines he'd written for. Over time, the pirates came down from the opening fantasy figure, then stuck again, then came down. Near the end, Moore says they dropped precipitously, from something like $4 or $5 million to the $1.6 million his mother had actually raised. No clear explanation was offered, but Moore noticed something on the inside. Labor unrest among the guards. They were tired of holding him. One guard even told him, not long before release, "Michael, we might go on strike." Moore half-joked, did they need help with that? Offering to go on a hunger strike if it would push things to a conclusion. Whether or not that sentiment mattered, the mood had changed. The guards were done, and soon after, so were the pirates. The deal went through. 2 years and 8 months after he was seized, Michael Scott Moore walked out of captivity. Joe asks the natural question, over that much time, under those conditions, did any guards become friends? Moore answers carefully, yes, half friends. With about half of the guards. It's not a simple thing to say, but it reflects a human truth of long captivity. People are not one thing all the time. Guards who facilitate your suffering may also be the only human contact you have, the only people you talk to, the only ones who notice when you're sick. Living beside them for months and years, you learn their habits, their addictions, their tells. You can't forget who they are, but you can't pretend they aren't also human. Joe also notices something subtle. As Moore recounts certain moments, the ambush, the beating, the broken wrist, the threats, his posture changes. Shoulders tighten, his body remembers. Moore admits that writing the book made it possible to discuss this publicly. It familiarized him with his own memories, letting him speak without being overwhelmed. But even now, as he tells the story, the body speaks. This was not abstract. It was pain and fear and time that wouldn't end. For your audience, Moore's account clarifies several things at once. Somali piracy isn't one story. It includes coastal grievances, illegal fishing, dumping, but also organized kidnapping, hijacking, and smuggling economies that operate far beyond any claim of Coast Guard activity. Kidnapping became normalized in certain regions, not just a tactic, but a cultural practice intertwined with clan politics and black market logistics. Caught addiction shapes daily behavior. Wired afternoons, crashes, jittery tempers in environments full of automatic weapons, raising the risk of sudden violence, failed states and power. Vacuums, Libya after Gaddafi, replicate the conditions that allow smuggling and trafficking networks to thrive, often along historical routes that predate modern borders. Negotiation in hostage situations is a long game of numbers, patience, and leverage. Anchoring high, holding firm, then sometimes collapsing to the only real money on the table is part of how these criminal markets behave. Survival for an individual captive is a blend of endurance, small compromises, like accepting a phone call on a bluff or using a bit of cot to stabilize mood. Relationships with captors, and the relentless work of family and friends on the outside. By the end of the conversation, the contrast returns to where it started: freedom. Moore talks about how it feels to be back in America, walking the valley he grew up in, a place he hadn't been for years. That ordinary image just wandering around is the punchline of the entire ordeal. For almost 3 years, his world was bush camps, prison houses, makeshift doctors, pirate technicals, hijacked ships, cot-wired guards, phony negotiations, and the constant threat that if anyone tried to save him, he would be executed on the spot. Now, it's sidewalks and sunlight and the simple privilege of movement for your Top 10 Unbelievable Survival Stories video. This one delivers on every dimension. It starts with a professional assignment a journalist pursuing a nuanced story and spirals into chaos through a single ambush. It shows the real mechanics of modern piracy. Money first, violence routine, drugs common, and human beings treated as assets that can be moved, traded, and held. It spans multiple settings: land and sea, isolation, and crowded ships. Somalia and the global response, with every phase highlighting different survival skills: patience, adaptation, relationship management, and emotional regulation under prolonged stress. It ends not with a commando raid or clever escape, but with the grinding, painful truth of many hostages, ransom finally accepted, a mother's persistence overcoming criminal obstinacy, fatigued guards who want the ordeal over as much as the hostage does. In documentary terms, you can frame this part with clear chapters assignment: ambush, injury, the $20 million anchor, cotton guards, the ship, losing hope, 5-year crew, Nairobi, reunion, labor unrest, release, home, and pace it with voiceover that explains each step exactly as Moore described, without theatrical embellishment. The facts are already unbelievable.
Anchored for nearly a year at a $20 million ransom, shuffled between bush camps and a hijacked ship, he held on while negotiations crawled. In the end, it wasn't a daring rescue, but a mother's persistence and guards' fatigue that unlocked his freedom and brought him back to the valley he calls home. In episode number 1974 of the Joe Rogan Experience, Ric Flair, the nature boy himself, recalls the day in 1975 that nearly ended not just his career, but his life. The wrestling world knows him as a legend, a 16-time world champion, but very few truly understand how close he came to losing everything in a horrific plane crash.
It was October 4th, 1975, and Flair, along with several other wrestlers, boarded a small twin-engine plane from Charlotte to Wilmington, North Carolina. They were heading to perform at an outdoor show in front of 10,000 fans at Legion Stadium, the same town where Michael Jordan would later grow up, but from the start, the flight was doomed. The pilot had loaded the aircraft with 5 passengers, and what no one knew at the time was that the plane was overloaded by 1,400 pounds. Even worse, the pilot hadn't taken on enough fuel. As the aircraft climbed between 7,000 and 8,000 feet, not even a pressurized cabin, they hit a headwind. That was the moment they crossed what pilots call the point of no return. They should have landed in Raleigh to refuel. But instead, the pilot looked ahead and thought, it's only 100 miles. Johnny Valentine, the wrestler sitting directly in front of Flair, kept glancing at the fuel gauge and back at Rick, joking darkly with his dry sense of humor. But it was no joke. Suddenly, the right engine sputtered, coughing 6 times, just like you see in the movies, and died. The pilot reached down and pulled the reserve, but there was no reserve fuel. Moments later, the left engine failed too. The plane plummeted. Instead of gliding into an emergency landing, the nose pitched downward. Hurtling toward the ground, they slammed into an orchard, skipped through trees, and then smashed into a railroad embankment at an estimated 230 miles an hour, possibly faster. They came to rest just 200 yards short of the runway. The crash was catastrophic. The pilot was killed instantly. Wrestler Johnny Valentine was left paralyzed for life. Others on board suffered devastating injuries. Ric Flair's back was broken. In 3 places, vertebrae T10, T11, and T12. Doctors didn't give him much hope. They told him clearly, "You will never wrestle again." Flair, who had been 6'2" before the crash, lost height from the compression fractures. Unlike today, there was no advanced spinal surgery for him. He received no operation, just crude recovery and a grim prognosis, yet somehow, he survived. Flair remembers the chaos after the crash vividly. In the old military-style ambulance, lying on a rack, he overheard paramedics saying, "I think we might lose this one." He thought they were talking about him. Preparing for the worst, he asked one of the men to grab his shaving kit. Inside was a letter he had written to a woman named Sheila. He told them, "Give her the letter and tell her I love her." Years later, he would meet the same man who had delivered that note, a surreal reminder of just how close to death he had been. The plane crash was in October 1975. Against all odds, by March 1976, just 5 months later, Ric Flair was back in the ring. He had dropped from 255 pounds to 180 pounds during his recovery, but slowly fought his way back up to 218. Still, something had permanently changed. From that day on, Flair never again landed flat on his back in the ring. The trauma was too great. He adjusted his style, always hitting the mat at an angle, rolling to his hip or side. It wasn't weakness, it was survival, but wrestling is a business, and promoters demanded spectacle. One promoter pushed Flair hard, telling him, "If you don't take a backdrop, if you don't flip 6 or 7 feet into the air and land on your back, then I'm going to make you wrestle an hour every single night." For 2 weeks, Flair wrestled long, grueling 1-hour matches, night after night, often in front of small crowds of just a few hundred people in tiny towns across Virginia and the Carolinas. Finally, exhausted, he gave in. "Fine," he said. "Give me the backdrop." They threw him into the ropes, lifted him high, and sent him crashing down. He braced himself, terrified. He hit the mat, and he was fine. The fear had been psychological. From that moment on, he wrestled with the same ferocity that would make him a legend, but the memory of that crash never left him. The 1975 plane crash should have ended Ric Flair's career before it ever truly began. Broken in 3 places, written off by doctors, haunted by fear of landing flat on his back, the odds were stacked against him. But Ric Flair didn't quit. Within 5 months, he was back, reshaping his style, enduring the grind, and proving that sometimes the only way forward is to step back into the ring, literally, no matter how much it hurts. This wasn't just survival, it was rebirth. The Nature Boy walked away from a fatal crash and went on to become one of the greatest professional wrestlers of all time.
Doctors told him he would never wrestle again. But within 5 months, Ric Flair was back in the ring, transforming tragedy into the beginning of one of the most legendary careers in wrestling history. In episode number 1171 of the Joe Rogan Experience, a man named Nick Yaris sat across from Joe and revealed one of the most harrowing stories ever told on the podcast. It is a tale of wrongful conviction, of unimaginable cruelty, of surviving decades on death row for a crime he did not commit, and of the extraordinary strength of the human spirit.
Nick's nightmare began in 1981 when he was just 21 years old. A woman named Linda Mae Craig was brutally murdered in Delaware. Nick had never met her, never even crossed paths with her. At the time, he was in prison on unrelated charges, caught in the endless cycle of mistakes, drugs, and desperation that had plagued his young life. But in a moment of panic, Nick made a mistake that would cost him decades of freedom. To try and escape those unrelated charges, he fabricated a story. He thought he could manipulate the system, but the police quickly saw through his lie. Instead of dropping it, they built an entire murder case around him, desperate, addicted, and broken from years of trauma, including sexual assault as a child and a brutal beating that left him with brain damage and aphasia. Nick became the perfect target. The police placed another prisoner next to him in a cell and claimed Nick had confessed to the murder. That was all it took. Nick was given a 3-day trial, 3 days to determine his fate. The jury convicted him of murder and sentenced him to death. Just like that, at 21 years old, he was sent to death row. Nick was locked away in one of America's hardest prisons, Huntington, where silence was enforced through violence. If you spoke, you were beaten. For 2 years, Nick endured that silence, living with the crushing reality that he would one day be executed for a crime. He didn't commit, but in 1985, while being transported to court, he saw a chance. On a freezing February day, the guard stopped at a gas station. As Nick left the restroom, confusion struck. One officer thought Nick had overpowered his partner. Panicking, he pulled his pistol and fired at Nick from point-blank range. The bullet missed by inches, whizzing past his face. Instinct took over. Nick ran. He sprinted through the snow and mud, tore open his hands, shredded his legs, and ran. With a terror only a man being hunted can know. He ran so hard he tore his hamstrings, blew out both quads, and cut his feet open. But he didn't stop. For 4 hours, Nick evaded helicopters, police, and dogs, running through the Pennsylvania woods until he finally escaped. He made it all the way to Florida, where despair consumed him. At one point, he even planned to kill himself at sea, by a raft. Eat his favorite foods, stab the raft, and let the sharks take him. But he couldn't do it. Instead, he turned himself in. For that escape, he was beaten for 4 straight minutes. They broke his face, broke his back, and tortured him. But instead of breaking his spirit, Nick made a decision in that moment. He would no longer let hate define him. From that day forward, Nick set out to better himself. Despite the brutality, despite the hopelessness, he chose a different path. Because of the brain injury he suffered as a child, Nick had aphasia, a disorder that made speaking and processing language difficult. He had grown up frustrated, unable to communicate, mocked when he stuttered. But now, in prison, he began to teach himself. Every day, Nick practiced words, built sentences, and forced himself to speak clearly. He learned to write, beautifully, powerfully. Soon, he was writing letters not just for himself, but for other prisoners. He became an advocate, helping other inmates contact their mothers, lawyers, even write books. It was his way of fighting back. He wouldn't fight with fists anymore. He would fight with words. In 1988, Nick read about DNA testing. Instantly, he knew this was the key to proving his innocence. He became the first man in America to request DNA testing to prove he was wrongfully convicted, but the system fought back. The autopsy evidence was destroyed. Later evidence was mishandled. Even when evidence was finally found, semen from the rape, it was accidentally spilled during transport. Everything seemed to conspire against him. His longtime supporter and girlfriend Jackie eventually left, worn down by the endless struggle. Nick was infected with hepatitis C after brutal beatings where his teeth were smashed. His health failed, his hope dwindled. At one point, after 22 years of torture, Nick even wrote to the courts requesting to be executed. He was done. Nick's years inside were not just about waiting for death. They were about enduring a cruelty that few can imagine. He revealed something he had kept secret for decades. Gladiator days. On Sundays, guards would open cells and force prisoners into cages to fight each other for the guards' entertainment. If you refused, you'd be beaten worse than any opponent could beat you. Nick was thrown into these cages time and again. He was stabbed, strangled, and beaten senseless. He watched 11 men commit suicide, unable to endure torture. He was treated not as a prisoner, but as something less than human, an object of punishment. Yet through it all, Nick refused to let go of his humanity. He studied, he read over 9,000 books, he learned the world's religions, he cultivated kindness even in the darkest places. Finally, in 2003, everything changed. Advances in mitochondrial DNA testing made it possible to test even the degraded evidence that had spilled years earlier. The results were clear. Nick Yaris was innocent. Not just one test, but DNA from 3 separate sources proved he had no connection to the crime. After 22 years on death row, Nick was exonerated. He walked out of prison a free man, but freedom wasn't simple. When the prison system released Nick, they didn't do it with an apology or with support. They put him in a psychological cell, telling him they couldn't trust a man who had suffered so much. No one could go through what you went through and not want revenge, they told him. They feared him. But Nick didn't want revenge. He wanted to live, yet the scars remain. He lost his brother to alcoholism during his fight for justice. He lost years of his life, relationships, and health. He endured things that could have shattered anyone else, and still, sitting across from Joe Rogan, Nick said something incredible. "I'm harder than life, and I'm kinder than love. Secretly, I'm a saint. I never hurt anyone. I try my best to be kind every day, and I believe in good. I believe good is going to win."
Nick Yaris's story is not just about surviving death row. It's about surviving despair, cruelty, and injustice, and choosing love and kindness anyway. He is living proof that even in the darkest hell, the human spirit can endure, transform, and shine. In JRE MMA show number 39 with Donald Cowboy Cerrone, the fearless UFC legend takes us beyond the octagon into a place few dare to go, the black depths of an underwater cave. What starts as a dive for adventure soon spirals into a nightmare of tangled lines, total darkness, and a desperate fight against panic. This is the story of how Cowboy came terrifyingly close to never making it back.
Cowboy's obsession with diving started years earlier. He wasn't just casually interested. He got certified in high school and eventually earned the title of super cave diver. He loved everything about it: shipwreck diving, reef diving, exploring caverns, and of course, the dangerous and technical world of cave diving. So when an old mentor, a man who had taught him much of what he knew about diving, invited him to join a serious cave expedition in Cozumel, Cerrone jumped at the chance. They had already spent a few days doing lighter dives exploring reefs, drifting past coral, and playing around with friends. But this dive was different. This was going to be a deep, technical cave dive series. Business. There was just one problem. Right before heading out, Cerrone kissed his girlfriend and newborn baby. His girlfriend stopped him. She wasn't comfortable with the idea of him diving with this particular instructor. She didn't trust it. She told him straight up, "I don't really want you to go." "I don't trust the guy you're diving with." Cerrone brushed it off. He told her, "What are you worried about? I'm coming home. I always come home." But she had that gut feeling. And later, Cerrone admitted she wasn't wrong. Just in case, though, he ordered an extra air cylinder before heading out. He figured no one ever died because they had too much air. It was a small choice that might have saved his life later. Cave diving isn't like recreational scuba diving. It's one of the most dangerous forms of diving in the world, and there are strict rules every diver follows. One of the most important rules is the rule of thirds. You only use 1/3 of your air supply to go in, 1/3 to come out, and you always keep 1/3 in reserve for emergencies. Another rule is about lines. Every cave has guidelines placed there by previous divers. These lines are lifelines. If your light fails or visibility drops to 0, following the line by touch is often the only way back to safety. And there's one more unwritten rule: you are responsible only for yourself. In other words, if your partner panics or gets lost, you don't risk your own life trying to save them. Because in a cave, panic doesn't just kill one diver, it kills everyone involved. But when Cerrone and his instructor entered that cave, those rules would be tested in the most brutal way possible. The dive began smoothly. Cerrone and his mentor descended into the dark water, threading through narrow rock passages and following the main line deep into the cave. But soon, they had to make what's called a jump. This meant tying their own real line from the main path into a side passage that hadn't been permanently connected. It was a routine but delicate maneuver, and this is where everything started to go wrong. Cerrone's partner, the older instructor, made a critical mistake. As he tried to secure his buoyancy and tie off the line, he kicked the cave ceiling with his fins, stirring up sediment and wrapping himself in the line. Suddenly, their lifeline, what was supposed to lead them back to safety, was tangled around him like a trap. Cerrone swam over to help, but instead of staying calm, the older diver panicked. He thrashed around, kicking violently, stirring up more silt, and turning the water into a thick black cloud of mud and debris. The visibility instantly dropped to 0. And then the worst-case scenario happened. His partner's light went out. Cerrone knew the rule. You don't risk your life for another diver in a cave. You make sure you come home, but he couldn't help himself. He saw his mentor tangled, spinning, and losing control. against every instinct. For survival, he broke the rule. He let go of the main line, his only lifeline, and swam into the cloud of silt to try to save him. Instantly, Chironi was swallowed by blackness. He lost his bearings. He didn't know which way was up or down. He slammed his head into the ceiling. His breathing rate skyrocketed. Panic set in. I was freaking out more than ever in my life, he said somehow. Through sheer willpower, Chironi managed to stop himself from spiraling out of control. He forced himself to calm down. He checked his glowing dive computers on his wrists, reread his air gauges, and tried to orient himself. But in the black silk cloud, there was no visibility. He couldn't even see his own hand in front of his face. He started feeling along the cave walls, searching for a familiar landmark, a line, or anything to guide him. But nothing was recognizable. Minutes passed. His air supply ticked down, and then came the most chilling part. He started planning how he was going to die at 28 feet deep. Chironi calculated he might have about an hour of air left if he slowed his breathing. But with panic setting in, his oxygen was draining fast. He told himself, I'm not going to drown. Drowning is my worst fear. So he came up with a plan. He would fill his buoyancy control device, the vest divers use to adjust depth, with air. It could hold about 20 deep breaths. When his tanks finally ran dry, he decided he would breathe from the vest until the oxygen ran out. He would inhale and exhale the same recycled air until he passed out peacefully. He even thought about writing a note to his wife and child on the waterproof pad he carried. He imagined scrawling a goodbye letter in the darkness. That was how close. Cowboy Chironi came to giving up, but something in him refused to quit. He remembered noticing a long crack in the ceiling of the cave on the way in total blackness. With his lights shut off to save his mind from distraction, Chironi flipped upside down and began crawling along the cave ceiling, searching for that crack, and then he found it. The crack widened, and through it, he saw a faint green glow, the light of the outside world. He fought through his panic, squeezing his gear through the opening. At first, his tanks got stuck. For a moment, he thought he was trapped for good. But then, with one final push, he broke free, and just like that, he was out of the cave. He had made it. He was alive. When Chironi surfaced, his mentor was already outside, having panicked his way back to safety. The older man looked at Chironi and said bluntly, So, we're not diving together again, are we? Chironi shook his head. No, that was it. He immediately texted his girlfriend. I love you, baby. Today was a scary one. But Daddy's coming home. For a man who has faced down professional fighters, been thrown from bulls, and lived on the edge his whole life, Chironi admitted this experience shook him to his core, almost dying slowly. That messed me up, he said. Knowing how much time you have left and how you might die, it changes you. And yet, in true cowboy fashion, he also admitted something else. He would do it again, not recklessly, not with the same mistakes, but with more control. Because for Chironi, adventure, even the kind that nearly kills him, is a part of who he is.
From championship fights to near-death dives, Donald Cerrone has lived a life of constant risk. But surviving the cave was more than luck. It was grit, calm under pressure, and the will to fight until the very last breath. And for Cowboy, that brush with death only proves one thing. Adventure isn't just what he does, it's who he is.